must say it's much nicer up here than sitting in the back for now. Let me take you on a journey a little bit into the weeds around building sustainable water systems, and specifically figuring out the data to allow you to build those systems. So I've worked with the Australian government for the last 7 years, and across a variety of roles, but all of those roles working on finding and building the connections between government, industry, and research. And what I've learned during that time is that both countries have strengths, and both offer, let's say, ways to learn from each other. And I'd like to focus on one today that I really find Australia being a leader in, and that's in adapting to climate change, and specifically around water. So we all know the challenges that face us. We've heard that as the impacts of climate change become more and more felt, that snowpack will decrease, rivers will flow at smaller rates, and that that rain patterns will start changing. And we're seeing that today. And it will come to a point that we'll need to take action sooner than later. So the best example that I've come to learn is around the Murray-Darling Basin, and how Australia, providing a world-leading, first-in-world example about how to address these changes. So let me define our terms right now. Murray-Darling Basin is one of the most diverse and important water systems in all of Australia. It takes up 14% of the country, and keep in mind that the US and Australia are about the same size landmass-wise. It has 40% of all farms rely on it. 3/4 of all irrigated crops rely on water that come from the basin. On top of that, it's a very important cultural area. So a lot of indigenous cultures consider it their home, and as well as it being a very important ecological basin with about 35 endangered species of birds, 16 endangered species of fish, and over 35 endangered species of mammals. So incredibly important. You can't emphasize it enough. It also crosses 4 of Australia's 6 states. Give a sense of size. So early in the 1990s, it became clear that there was a huge issue. Australia had been in the longest drought that it had ever seen. It's called the Millennial Drought from 1997 to 2010. Water levels were decreasing significantly. Salinity was increasing significantly, and the populations of birds and fish were decreasing. Those key points made it abundantly clear that water allocations that had been handed out like Halloween candy. That's a translation from Australian term to American term. And that there'd been a double accounting in groundwater and surface water. So meaning that allocations for water, a certain amount of water had been handed out twice. And it became clear that if something hadn't changed, if no action was taken, that Australia would lose its main source of water. And I'm not, I mean that directly. And let me add one more thing that kind of gives you a picture about how important this water system is. So South Australia has its capital city, 40% of the inhabitants rely on water from this region. So all farms, more than half of the farms would cease to exist. Entire capital city would have half the water that it could have, and you'd lose a significant population of wildlife, as well as the cultural implications. So something had to be done. What happened was, I think, particularly living in California, you would recognize as a minor miracle. They were able to bring together, they realized that in order to build a sustainable solution, you actually had to know how much water was out there. They had no idea. And so a 3-year plan to be able to identify how much water was running through the system, how much water, when you take into account of climate change, was going to be through the system in the next 10, 20, 30 years, and how much water was being used, who was using it, legitimately and illegitimately. And all of that needed to be put into a model to be able to understand how to build this plan. And so they brought together 4 state governments. I'm just trying to think about bringing together the 4 state governments and the western half of the United States, and that's no small feat. On top of that, 18 regional governments. It's also no small feat. And nearly 100 associations, organizations, and universities, all that had a vested interest in the area. And they had to come to a consensus. And they actually did, which is still a marvel. And what came of it was a 3-year study called the Murray-Darling Sustainable Yields Project, which was the world first gathering of intelligence around water levels taking into account climate change. And it involved, to give you an idea of, again, how massive this was, 1.4 billion water simulations. Produced over 40 peer review technical studies and 19 reports. And again, back to my earlier weeds comment, this is just so that you would be able to build a sustainable plan, right? Just to get the data. And it was successful. And they were able to take that data, bring together state and local governments, and come up with a plan in order to save water levels. It involved buying back allocations from farmers, again, no small feat. And it involved, they had a strategy that 100% of all vested parties needed to come to agreement in order to move forward, and they did. Took a little while. But in 2012, they enacted a plan. And for the last 5 years, it's been fairly successful. We've seen water levels return. We've seen fish and wildlife return. Though the scientists that I spoke to who were on this project would like to emphasize along the waterways. So not in let me rephrase that. The success has been where the water hits the land. And in the broader flood ranges, there's still work to be done. But it's not all rosy. We've had issues with enforcement. And when you have something that goes across 4 states that takes up 14% of the land mass, it becomes a little difficult to be able to enforce and enforce farmers from making their own little rivers that come off of this one for irrigation. But it has set the absolute basis for all research and all sustainability projects throughout Australia and the US. Hopefully soon the US, the world. There's been a couple other projects. And so, as I said earlier, it was just the start, right? Technology has gotten better, and climate modeling has gotten better. And so now we're able to develop new sustainability plans, build upon the Murray-Darling Basin plan, and really have a better grasp of how we can prepare for a decrease in water resources in a sustainable way. So right now, Australia's been, again, taking the lead and looking at all of northern Australia, so nearly half of Australia's landmass, and using this new technology with the old methodology, including new satellite imaging to allow for a rapid land assessment, using new soil assessments, new climate models that are much more accurate than they were back in 2007, and to be able to understand what regions can handle growth. Should we expand farming? knowing that in 10 years, water patterns are going to shift over the ocean? Can this city sustain more growth given that soil content quality is decreasing? These are the questions that scientists now can answer and act upon. And so as we go forward, we need to recognize that we do have the capability and the technology does exist. And to be very blunt about it, we don't exactly have a choice, and we'll move forward. Thanks.